Good afternoon, everyone. We are the last panel, so let's make this a little bit more interesting. Before we started, I've already instructed my panelists to disagree with one another, so hopefully we'll get something interesting going.
No, I refuse.
Yeah, there you go, started already. I thought before we get into all the questions, we can do a quick introduction. Maybe starting with Simon, then Prithvi, then Zeke, then Michael. Maybe some quick introduction of your work and how it relates to the safe adoption of AI.
Sure, so I'm the one with the ridiculously long title, but the short version is I'm a lawyer who's trying to push back against the idea that the main job of the lawyer is to be the minister of no. Because the easiest thing for a lawyer to do is say, don't do anything. I'm much more interested in trying to work out how we get the benefits of AI in various use cases, including homeland security and so on, while minimizing or mitigating the risks.
Thanks. I'm good friends with lawyers because they tell us what's right and wrong in terms of what we can do with technology. So I'm the founder of Borneo. We help companies, we enable companies with safe data and AI use. I also sit on the board of TechX. Before this, I've spent close to 2 decades building large-scale safety and security solutions for companies such as Meta, Uber, and Yahoo. A lot of those learnings have gone into what we're trying to do at Borneo.
Yeah, hi. The Academy of Law is an institution that takes care of lawyers. So we need to do 2 things, right? One, we need to teach lawyers how to make the best use of these tools that are powered by AI so that they're a lot more efficient and a lot more effective. But the other thing that's really keeping us up at night is really thinking about, with AI coming into the hands of everyone, how is it going to change the expectation of clients when they speak to lawyers, and how do we train lawyers for the new way of practice? So that's kind of like what I'm doing now for my day job.
My name is Michael Zeller, and I'm head of AI strategy and solutions at Temasek, and we look after everything from not just investments, but also our existing portfolio, and help them really understand what AI can and cannot do, and where they need to be paid attention to. Especially, if it's such a tremendous, impactful technology, then we need to have at the core really responsible AI as our principle, how we build systems and how we design it. And that translates even to some of the ventures that we're starting around responsible AI and how to test, verify, and inspect AI, complex AI systems in mission-critical applications.
Thanks, everyone. I'm very happy to be on stage with this wonderful group of panelists. Before I dive into the questions, I thought I'll invite all of you to answer one question first on Pigeonhole. So if you could bring out the Pigeonhole QR code. So we have a quick poll to find out from all of you, what are your concerns with regards to the use of AI? So if you were to go to the QR code, you should be able to respond to this poll, and then we'll get a quick sense of the room of where do you think the issues are. Is it in privacy and security? Is it in false information and bias? Is it in lack of transparency and in the decision-making process? How are we doing? Maybe after that deepfake presentation, I should have put one answer, which is deepfakes.
You got false information there.
Oh, that's true, yeah. Okay, just a couple more seconds, and then we will take a look at where we are with the poll. It looks like most of you are not too worried about transparency or explainability for that matter. So don't have to be too worried about how the model works and comes up with decisions. Okay, so it looks like topping the poll is false information and bias, with about half of you thinking that that's really a major concern. And then privacy and security issues, and then finally lack of transparency in the decision-making process. So turning to my panelists, I just wanted to get a sense from all of you, what you think of the response, and do you agree? Maybe I start with Mike.
I would actually have guessed the number one, the privacy and security is an issue on most people's mind. I would think that, especially in terms of cybersecurity risks, you can use it, of course, to defend yourself with generative AI these days on solutions, but it can also be in the wrong hands, quite misused. So I would be number one in that bar.
Okay, so number one, privacy and security concerns, especially cybersecurity concerns, right?
Especially cybersecurity.
With regards to Gen AI. How about you, Prithvi?
I think cybersecurity and privacy is, I'm biased because that's my business. But when we talk to more companies, protecting against information generated by AI, content generated by AI is always top of mind. So when you go and pitch two solutions, they're like, can your solution also help us identify what's AI generated and what's not? Usually comes up more from an urgency perspective. That's what we're seeing.
Is that more related to Gen AI implementation or traditional AI
I think
implementation?
two things have happened, right? With the proliferation of Gen AI, with OpenAI, what they're doing, I think suddenly this toolkit is available to the masses, both bad actors and good actors. And companies are grappling because there is a part of you which is like, oh, I want to make this available for all my employees. But there's a part of you where how do I ensure sensitive data is not leaking to the models and all that stuff. There's the other use case also, how do I make sure that the content coming out of it is validated to be true, right? There's no misinformation, there's nothing, there's no negative bias coming out, because that could also be consumed by our end users or also by our other applications. So those are the kind of two things, right? Like, I think it's a very powerful tool. People want to embrace it, use it, but they want to have what we call some guardrails around it.
Looks like the audience agrees with you, actually. False information as a top concern. Maybe coming around to, okay, Simon, looks like you want to answer, right?
No, I just want to put in a shout out to my peeps who put, 17% of you put transparency. Because I think it's understandable that people in the homeland security space don't always think that transparency is a good thing, and that's for good operational reasons. But when it comes to AI, the fact that we don't understand how these models are making determinations, I think can be a real concern for those in the public sector, because one of the biggest shifts over the past decade is the move of this technology from public to private hands. Because what are now foundation models or large language models, generative AI, started in academia, but increasingly are controlled by huge corporations because of the expense, because of the requirement of talent, data, compute that you need. And so if you're in the public sector, you need to understand how those models are making those determinations, because however those determinations are made, you are the ones who are going to be on the hook for the outcome. So I wouldn't write off transparency as an issue, at least not just yet.
And Zeke, do you agree?
Well, I was going to make one observation and follow up on the comments by Simon. I think the top bar was bias and false information, right? Well, one example of bias is a selection bias. I guess in this room, right, most of us are actually concerned with false information because probably a lot of us are working in that area, and we are very preoccupied with those issues. If we had run this poll in a room of data protection professionals, I'm sure privacy would be up top. So an example of how bias happens, nothing wrong, right? It's just the fact of the data sets and the collection of people. So I just wanted to just make that observation. I want to pick up the points that Simon made about transparency. Yes, there is one aspect of transparency around explainability, whether you agree with the outputs of the model and whether you're able to explain, right, how it came about to that output. But I also want to highlight a second dimension of transparency, which for us in this room in security is absolutely important as well. It is transparency and about that interaction between us as agencies, right, with members of the public and the people that we interact with. Transparency has that aspect as well. When, for example, you are using AI in certain situations, giving out some information, informing the members of the public that you're interacting with, that sometimes this technology is deployed, can build trust. Transparency can have that effect if we are using it properly. And trust is the rarest commodity, right, in the world. And for, at least in Asia, there's a high level of trust between the public and security agencies, and that's a commodity that I think we need to preserve. So think of transparency also as being relevant to preserving the trust so that you're able to continue to be able to do our jobs effectively.
Can I jump
Yes,
in?
Mike, yes.
Yeah, Simon made a really good and really important point is that a lot of the, at least on the generative AI side, a lot of the power is now in very few hands. And there's, I think, an important role that transparency has to play there, because now you have very few large organizations that control at least most of the closed source models in generative AI. And so there's an important aspect here on open source developments that need to happen. There is some transparency that those large companies need to bring. There's even geopolitical implications here, because most of those organizations sit in one country. So they're concentrating talent, they have the cash to run it, to deploy those models, and who else competes there? So I think open source is a very, very effective way also to create transparency.
I mean, I thought that's pretty interesting to bring up open source, because I'm going to just dive a little bit deeper into that. People say open source is both a good and a bad. Good because now you can have a mechanism to better understand how these models work. Bad because you're making it available to bad actors to be able to access these models to do all kinds of misdeeds and awful things, right? And crimes and so on. So I think that's going to be a problem in terms of finding that balance. So anything that you want to add to that, Mike? Yeah.
If you look at even the AI luminaries, Geoffrey Hinton and Jan LeCun had an open discussion and debate and disagreed vehemently, violently on what should be the right approach. One for open source, the other one against open source. I believe transparency hopefully will win. I think us being aware of what models can and cannot do is very, very important. And the technology is out in the open anyways. The Transformer paper that was published in 2017 by Google researchers is basically the foundation on all of the transformer models, all the generative AI models that we see today. So it's out in the open already.
That's true. Maybe Zig, you want to add to that, since you're sort of using open source right now?
Yeah, I was going to just broaden that discussion a bit. So first, on the point of transparency, doesn't matter open source or proprietary, transparency has its role. I think one of the things that transparency can play, especially when you are talking about the proprietary models that are in the hands of the few, right? Greater transparency about your training data set, for example. Greater transparency about the expected behavior, the parameters that can actually influence the outcome. So there can be that amount of transparency that can build up trust so that people can choose to use those models or not. On the flip side, for open source, yes, we've been down this path before in the context of OSS, right? The open source software, right? We've been down this path before. I think the benefits are pretty obvious. You're essentially providing choice. And the sector that I come from, which is the legal sector, deals a lot with client confidential information and deals a lot with commercially sensitive information. And those are reasons why there is a lot of hesitation using models that are hosted on the cloud. There is a lot of hesitation about believing the sales pitch to say that this is this is private, right? This instance is actually sequestered. No one else can look at it. There's a lot of discomfort. Having an open source model actually provides option for some of these use cases who are then able to get started sooner rather than later. And I think we shouldn't forget that there are these benefits as well. So it's not really just about being open to attacks, but being open as the form of providing greater choice and opportunities for all.
Maybe this is a good sort of segue to Prithvi, since you're doing a lot of implementation and you have all these considerations as well.
So I think, like both of them rightly pointed out, right? I think if you look at our learnings from the OSS journey, right, with open source, I think one of the benefits is net, it's good for innovation because it levels the playing field. There's no entry barrier for anyone to come. Now, if you look at traditional databases or data warehouses, I think one parallel track that happened is because if it's open source, people were able to develop other scaffolding in terms of security tools, testing tools, pen test tools around that, very easily be able to test it against it. So for me, so we have open sourced our stack. The reason we open source our stack is because now we are opening it up for QA to the public. So I would like to believe, like with some of these open source models, a lot of these threat vectors get identified, and then people have an incentive to build precautionary or preventive controls or preventive tooling, pen testing tooling around that, which will actually help us with adoption and also help us with some of these threat detection and prevent malicious use cases early on.
Okay, Simon.
I'm happy to be the naysayer about open source. I accept that it's probably inevitable that you'll have some open source. And I'm not saying this just because anything Mark Zuckerberg does is necessarily suspect, but I'm quite wary of why Meta decided to make Llama open source, because it makes no commercial sense, but does make sense if you think there's an attempt to essentially undermine the market or to sort of, Meta wasn't going to win the game, so they flipped the board over. That's one interpretation. But my larger concern is not the one that's often said that, okay, this is going to teach people how to make biological weapons. I think that's conceivable. But if you extrapolate forward, is this software, is this technology going to be more like an operating system? In which case, yes, it makes sense to open source. But even the operating systems, last week, there was this revelation that Microsoft discovered there was an exploit that was put into the Linux operating system that could have propagated through the internet. That would have disrupted the internet. But if that was foundation models that were used in government systems, in corporate systems around the world, we don't know what the consequences could be if people are relying on that. So I think the fact that we don't know where this technology is going, we don't know the risks, there are so many unknown unknowns, the idea that we should just say, yeah, here's this toy, go play with it, and we'll rely on there being more of the pen testers and more kind of white hat and fewer black hat. We don't know what the black hat exploits would be, and so in that situation I'd be very wary about just saying, yeah, everyone just play around with this and we'll see what happens.
I'm going to steer the conversation away from open source now to something else, but before I do that, as moderator, I feel like I should at least share a little bit of the work that I do. And since we're on open source, I'll talk a little bit about an open source tool that IMDA has put out called AI Verify. So it's a tool for organizations to demonstrate the trustworthiness of their AI systems. So go to AI Verify, Google it, and you'll find out more about it. And I'll stop right now, right? Okay, coming back to the panel, and not talking about open source, maybe we'll share a little bit about some of the other concerns and risks away from the three that we have identified with the audience. What else are there? Maybe Simon, since you were last to speak, maybe just share, is there other concerns, national security issues, or anything else?
Yes, I mean, for this crowd in particular, I mean, so 23 years ago, I was living in New York around the time of September 11 and doing research on, at the time, post-conflict administration, which then became much more of a thing in Iraq. But I got interested in the way in which surveillance powers were deployed in the United States, and increasingly, technology could be used to enhance those surveillance powers. And clearly, there's enormous potential for useful use cases and for risks. In addition to the risks of just violating the law, two risks that I think are worth at least keeping in mind are, first, that profiling, the reducing of humans to statistics, runs the risk of treating people as means rather than ends. And this is something that philosophers like Kant have argued about for centuries. And you can illustrate this by saying, okay, if you want to stop jaywalking, and I had this argument in America once, you want to stop jaywalking, just every year or two, execute a jaywalker. And there would be a net benefit, because the net benefit would be fewer jaywalkers, but at the expense of that one person being shot on the street. So probably not worth doing. And there is a concern, if you reduce people's statistics, you treat them as means rather than ends. This is the same reason that we shouldn't be using AI for sentencing. And so Singapore's Chief Justice has come out and said, we're not going to use AI for sentencing. Even though there's a lot of data, we want to treat individual cases individually. So I think there's a real wariness on that front. So that's one type of concern. The second type of concern is if you go down the profiling rabbit hole, and this kind of happened in the United States, and President Biden has been open about some of the excesses that America engaged in after September 11, you run the risk of creating the problem you're trying to solve. So if you use profiling to identify a particular group of people as being problematic and you use the tools of surveillance and so on at your disposal, yes, you get more information about that group, but you might alienate them further and therefore exacerbate the problem that you were actually trying to address. So those kind of ethical and pragmatic considerations in how we deploy surveillance, I think, remain very live issues today.
I think for this crowd, maybe surveillance would be a good example of concerns. But are there others, like for example, from the industry perspective, right? Are there other concerns that we need to be worried about in terms of AI implementation?
Yeah. So I think something which is more pressing and urgent, which we hear and come across and help solve, right? One is AI infrastructure. Now, with governments and companies adopting it, spending a ton of money, it's become a new vector of attack. If I'm a bad actor, I'll try to kind of target AI infrastructure because the ROI has just gone up incrementally for me. So just understanding what, where your data is to train these models, where the infrastructure is, and it's super expensive, and kind of protecting is one top risk that we need to kind of grapple with, right? Both, especially if it becomes core part of our infrastructure. The second one is it's around the use of consent, right? We are already in this world where what I call is we're grappling with privacy debt. Large companies have collected a lot of data. They're used for targeting, retargeting, a lot of use cases. Now with AI, I don't know what I have consented to, but using AI, the use cases can kind of get multiplied, and there'll be a lot of other new retargeting things, profiling that could come up. How do I ensure, right? And the regulatory, I think policymakers are grappling with it. It's too early. How do we make sure that my data that I was given for purpose X is now not being used for purpose Y and Z, right? That assertion. That's the second one that we keep hearing, and that kind of keeps coming up. And the third is more from a sustainability. I did a talk on sustainability yesterday. Perspective. I think companies already we were living this paradigm where we were like, data has option value, so we're going to keep as much data as possible all the time. Now suddenly this option value has gone up 10x. I think we're going to see massive increase in amount of storage and compute, and that has a direct environmental impact too. I think the last stats I heard is 60 to 70% data centers today still run on coal power, right? So that's the other thing I think we need to kind of think of, right? Those are the top three things that I think about.
Yeah, that's a big problem to be solved. But I wanted to pick up on your consent point and use of personal data, and I'm just going to turn to Zeke and see whether he has anything he wants to say on this, since this used to be his day job for a while before SAL.
Yeah, so I personally think that consent is overrated, right? Ask yourself, how many times this week did you click through a cookie notice without reading? How many times today, right? Yeah, and how many of us have started receiving all these emails with footers about confidentiality, safeguards, and all these caveats around official secrets? Do we read them anymore? We start seeing all these anchors in subject heading about external. Does it make a difference anymore? So for me, what I would like to see really is that the right people be made responsible, and the right people take responsibility. Consent is really passing the buck to the weakest link in the chain. Just by thinking that you consented, I can do whatever I want. Actually, the people who are holding the data and using the data, the people who are providing the tools, we should be looking at them to talk to them, and there are a smaller handful of people, right? Rather, the smaller number of people, and we should be talking to them about what does good look like? What's a good responsible developer? What's a good responsible developer of models, of systems? So that's that. The other thing that I thought that came to mind as I heard Prithvi speak, right, is really around data. We get caught up by this thing about we need more data, we need to collect more data, because without more data we can't do AI. But the reality is that you need data to a certain extent, but what beats more data is better quality data. And that's something that I've learned to be true. So the old things, right, that were taught to computer engineers around how do you maintain the quality of your data, those disciplines, right, the structure, is all the more important and allows you to do more with AI today, right? It's not, having more data helps to some extent, having better quality data helps to a greater extent. So that discipline is very important as well.
So I'm going to turn to Mike and ask, what does good look like when it comes to data?
Well, that's a good question. How quality data looks like, how much it people that contribute to have consented it to is one thing. I actually wanted to just say what concerns me is actually much simpler. It's like the speed of innovation that we're currently seeing, and that we can't necessarily keep up with what we need to do. You mentioned AI verify, so how do you test, verify, inspect those models that have grown in size dramatically, from a few million parameters to hundreds of millions to hundreds of billions of parameters. Now we have these massively complex systems that we put out into the wild, and we don't know necessarily where they break. And that's, I'm a physicist, for me that's very unsatisfying. Right? I just take a bigger and bigger hammer and say, oh, look at the cool things it can do, but I don't necessarily know when it starts failing. And that's, I think, one concern. And regulation is, given the speed of innovation, is not able to keep up with any of the security concerns that we might have around that part. So I think a simple concern, but I think a very important one as the complexity of the systems has increased dramatically.
I think that's a good point. Innovation versus regulation, right? Is regulation able to keep up? When is it too early or too late to regulate? I'm going to just turn to Prithvi because we had a little conversation about this earlier, and then maybe Simon can chime in as well on regulation versus innovation. Where do we stand? Because in Singapore, we're trying to find that balance, creating that trusted ecosystem where there's enough space for innovation, while at the same time making sure that we address some of the more egregious harms through regulations and guidelines and other mechanisms. But Prithvi, what's your point of view on this?
So I think at a meta level, regulations with clear standards and guidelines, right? And where it's a two-way street, where you're also listening to the industry as a regulator, net is good. And specifically, I think for AI, even I'm scared in terms of I don't know where this will end. The innovation is so fast that's needed. Going back to my journey when we looked at early days of Yahoo, Facebook, we did a lot of stuff. And at that time when we implemented these, we were collecting data, targeting, all that stuff, right? Building massive data centers. I think we did what we thought was best for the business and the consumer. The regulatory landscape was a little complex. We didn't know, GDPR came on much later. We thought what we were doing was right. There was not a lot of, because you are also innovating, right? The industry was new. So I think what ended up happening net is you ended up with privacy dead. But in a way, it also benefited the early tech companies. They managed to get a lot bigger because they were able to do a lot of stuff around data, right? Which a lot of the smaller incumbents who came later struggled to do. I think with AI, policymakers have an opportunity, and I think that's why they're probably rushing, because they learned from the last 2 decades, right? I think there is an opportunity here to engage with the industry and try to shape regulations. And I think the most important thing is to make sure that the guidelines are clear and also give some guidance in terms of how to implement it, because technology is new, it's expensive, even finding people, there's a skill set knowledge gap as well, right? So I think getting ahead of it, making sure it's translatable to actual implementation would probably be net positive.
It's actually quite unusual to hear the industry saying, come, let's work with us to develop regulations. Simon?
Yeah, and whenever that happens, you should be very wary.
Yeah.
Because when Sam Altman goes before Congress and says, regulate us, he's doing it for 3 reasons. I think they recognize some kind of regulation would be useful. And in that sense, it's a big shift from 25 years ago when Bill Gates used to brag that Microsoft didn't even have an office in Washington, D.C. They just wanted to be left alone. So that's one consideration. The second is that they know regulation of some form is coming, so they want to be part of it. They want to be in the room rather than just waiting to find out. But the third thing, and I think this is kind of an open secret, is that, by having regulation, it raises the cost of entry for competitors. And so it benefits the market players. But a challenge for a small jurisdiction like Singapore is that we don't want to be the leader in regulation. Because if we can err on 2 sides, we can under-regulate, in which case you expose people to risk, and that's a bad thing. But if you over-regulate, then you drive innovation elsewhere, especially for a small country. So when the European Union has the Digital Service Act, Digital Markets Act, it means that Meta delays releasing threads for some months. If that had been Singapore, Meta might have just said, well, Singapore is too small a market to worry about, so we'll just get out of here. So those are some of the considerations, but I think your point earlier about the when to regulate is key. And I think one reason why there are so many discussions about governing AI is precisely the wariness on the part of government based on 2 decades of social media, and realizing that actually if we'd acted earlier in regard of social media, then maybe we could have avoided some of the problems today. And so that's why you see a lot of discussion about governance, then exacerbated by the fact that you've got the coincidence in 2024 of all this amazing deepfake technology, and the first time in human history when half of people on the planet are living in countries that are having or likely to have national elections. And so that, I think, highlights for politicians in particular the need to at least be aware of some of the risks and maybe act to mitigate them.
And I think actually previous point is for smaller companies, actually it's good for government to be clear and to be early in defining some of these requirements so that they can prepare themselves, right? And I think finding that balance of not stifling innovation and actually being clear about what we think are important, it's what I think Singapore is trying to do a lot of actually in the area of AI regulations. And I think since we're talking about regulations and we're talking a little bit about solutioning a little bit now to some of the risks that we raised earlier, and I'm going to start switching this conversation towards thinking about how can we address some of these concerns. Before that, you can actually ask questions. So I thought if you could have the QR code for the pigeonhole again, you can actually use that to ask questions for any of the panelists, and we'll try and address them. But in the meantime, while you think of your question, I'll ask my questions. So how can we work together, right? We have representatives here from government, from academia, from industry. What do you think we can do to address all of these doom and gloom scenarios that we raised just now? Any volunteers to start first? Okay, Mike.
Okay, it's going to be a concerted effort, right? So it can't be just government alone, it can't be just industry, it can't be just academia. It really goes hand in hand. So on one side, you could say, well, you can't regulate what you don't understand. So we need to understand more, how those systems work, and when they break and where the risks are. I mean, there's ulterior motives, like Simon mentioned. So you have to kind of drown the noise out a little bit to just make sure that you don't follow large companies that have ulterior motives to ask for regulations. So that's one thing. On the academic side, I think it's a very important research topic to really try and probe systems, and that's where I think open source makes a lot of sense. AI Verify as one initiative to kind of pool resources, and if you look at the membership list, you get everyone from large to small companies realizing how important it is to test, to verify, to inspect those models. So I think overall we need to come together to try and solve this, because the industry I think will have a challenge. I think back to GDPR days. When GDPR was coming, everybody knew it was coming. Nobody knew what to do about it. And the only ones who profited from that was a lot of consulting firms that did a lot of consulting work on how to implement GDPR. Now, we've had 10 years on it. Hopefully with AI regulation, we'll be a little clearer in guidelines that help industry to go into the right direction.
Anyone else? Simon?
Sure. So I think one of the useful, I had a Canadian colleague who used to say, no one's completely useless, you can always be a bad example. So I think it's good to take good examples, but also, and AI Verify, I think Singapore has enormous potential precisely because we have these open lines of communication. It's a small country, highly digital, highly connected. There's a real interest, not just in having that conversation here, but using Singapore as a platform. I think America is a good bad example, where I think there's a lot of techno-utopianism still, but the saga at OpenAI last year, which many of you will have seen, Sam Altman being sacked and then reinstated, what that really was a test of corporate governance and the idea that self-regulation would take care of these problems. And the short answer is that the money won. Because basically what happened was there was a not-for-profit. So OpenAI was set up as a not-for-profit originally. Elon Musk is suing over this. It was set up as a not-for-profit with the promise of OpenAI for everyone. And then it grew, realized it needed money, hired some lawyers, and then suddenly became closed, not talking about the content of what it was being trained on. But there was still this tension between a not-for-profit board and a company that needed to make money in order to develop the AI systems. And when push came to shove in a fight between the not-for-profit and the for-profit, the not-for-profit lost, and those members of the boards, or many of them have left. So what I think we need is not just these sort of multidisciplinary conversations, but also multi-level conversations, which means the most important will remain self-regulation. It'll still be important that people do the right thing for the right reasons, but you also need governments to step in. Governments can't just sort of sit in the back and hope that companies will behave, because companies are motivated to make profits. So you need governments to step in. Governments have the regulatory hammer. But governments can't coordinate. And so that's where I think you need at least some thin level of international coordination. And so in May, the UN will have a meeting here. I declare an interest. I'm involved in the AI advisory body. And there's no way the UN should be put in charge of this. That'd be a terrible thing. But the UN can play that role of coordinating, trying to agree on common standards, common information levels, so that hopefully we, again, can get the benefits while minimizing or mitigating the risks.
Since Simon started talking about governments and different countries' approach, maybe I'll just turn to Zeke to talk a little bit about that. How do we compare across different countries? Or maybe you want to talk about something else?
Yeah, can I talk about something else first?
Yes, of
Then
course.
I get back to it. Then you remind me what you want to ask me. No, so we're in a lot of these discussions about should we regulate, when should we regulate, how do we regulate. But actually, speaking from someone who had to regulate an area, right? I'll share with you how I usually break this thing down. You want to regulate, first you need to know the principles. Are the principles clear? Second, what you want to know are also are the expected standard of behavior, the standard of conduct. Is that well established that you can, and you know what standard you are expecting the regulated entities to hold themselves up to? The third thing is, are you able to measure, right, that they have actually met those standards or fallen below those standards? For an area like AI, right, principles, I think there's a fairly universal consensus about what the broad ones are. So I think, okay, I'll just give that a green light. But I think the next 2 points is actually where industry needs to come together, working with maybe research institutions and academia, and policymakers need to be part of that and listen as well. Because what are the standards that we should be holding up as benchmarks? We talk about bias testing. What is there a number? Is there a mark that we should hold? Is that the same for different sectors? Even in the same sector for different applications, what do those look like, right? Until we start coming to some consensus around those, right? For someone who is deploying, how do I know that I have reached the requisite standard that I can actually put my system out, right? And then if I wanted to just be sure, and I want to get an auditor to come and check, are they able to measure? And I think that's where tools like AI Verify, open source tools, right, for measurement is important, but equally important is actually industry coming together to say that, you know what, for a review of CVs in the context of just coming in for the interview, I think this is a good benchmark, right? And we think that this is good enough, right? We need to have more of those developed so that we can move forward. So I think that's kind of like what I wanted the points I wanted to make about this whole thing about regulation. We all have a part to play, but we need to prioritize which ones and place emphasis on the different parts.
Okay, I'm going to ask my question later, because I think, just picking up on your point about standards, I wanted to ask Prithvi.
Yeah.
Right, are you facing these questions as you implement AI systems? Do you know what the standards are?
Yeah.
And what problems are you?
Yeah, I think it's a great segue, right? And this comes back to the same thing, right? This is kind of the business logic, right? Where do we work from here? If this is not clear, if this part is not clear, what are we regulating or what the standards are, the implementation just falls apart. right? So what we are looking at, I think people are really concerned about, is the right data going into my model training, right? And is the prompt returning the right thing and there's no leakage happening there? Or like what if insensitive or illegal content comes in or goes out, right? That's a big challenge. Now, I look at from implementation layer, if this was clearer, companies usually ask us like in two categories of problem. One is moderation, where do we know what is good, what is bad, and how do we write the rule sets to kind of filter it out so that it doesn't go into the model or reflect from the model. Because what also happens is there are all these applications and end users consuming the output that is coming out. And if there is content that can be socially insensitive, that could actually create a lot of problems downstream, right? That's one. The other thing is, like you rightly, the CV example is a great example. We see this in fintechs, where it's very use case based filtering. So for example, if you're a fintech company, maybe there is certain type of private financial data that you don't want to be going in. And so the filtering for that has to be implemented very, very differently. One of the things we are seeing is using standards like C2PA, where we can look at metadata and understand the provenance of that. Was it generated by AI, or was it kind of data somebody actually gave in and we are using that? So using things like that, like it's a good analogy to that is TLS, right? Using transport layer security, we can know that this has come from this authentic website. So similar to that, but I think the first step is really solving the high level problem around do we have the right standards, and then companies can take that and build it into the implementation layer.
So I think that all that's true, but one of the challenges in discussions like this is sometimes we're not necessarily solving the right problem, or we're over-valorizing humans. Because for all the concerns about AI, and I think everyone's familiar with the problem of AI, alleged AI bias. AI is not biased. The underlying data set might be biased. Why is it biased? Because humans are biased. And actually, sometimes I worry not that AI will be held to too low a standard, but that it might be held to too high a standard. If you think about autonomous vehicles would be easy if you only had autonomous vehicles on the road. The problem for autonomous vehicles is interacting with humans, bicycles, dogs, cats, crazy humans who want to put traffic cones on top of them. And in the homeland security space in particular, I think we rightly worry about bias, and I wouldn't want to outsource discretion to machines. But in some situations, AI might actually be better, because if you ask an AI system if it's biased, for the most part, it will try and tell you the truth. No human's ever going to tell you, yeah, I'm biased, I'm racist, I'm sexist. And so sometimes I think we do want to be entirely alert to these kinds of concerns, but there are certain benefits of automating at least the lower risk systems and using the tools available in an AI system to check whether we're actually upholding our own standards as humans, quite apart from what the AI is doing.
Actually, that's a good point on bias, and I'm actually going to highlight one of the questions that have been raised on Pigeonhole about when there's bias in the systems. I mean, you mentioned that it's because of data and so on, but regardless, when there's bias in the system, whose responsibility is it to address this problem? Is it the problem of, does the responsibility lies with the agency using the AI solution? That means could be a government agency, or is the responsibility with the company providing the AI systems?
So I did a whole book on regulating artificial intelligence, but the short version, so you don't have to buy it now, is that most laws can govern most AI use cases most of the time. So the short answer is, yeah, the agency making the decision, you can't outsource responsibility. And so as you think about your own use cases for AI, think of it like outsourcing. And so you can outsource your laundry, no problem. Outsource catering, transportation. Should you outsource the discretion that you exercise in whether to detain someone, whether to arrest them, convict them, sentence them? No. And I think Singapore's government gave very clear instructions back in the early days of ChatGPT that by all means you can play around with this stuff, but two considerations apply. One, don't enter confidential or personal data because you're giving it to these companies. And two, whatever the AI spits out, you are making the decision. So as you think about relying on AI, think of it like asking Microsoft, like asking Google, what do you think I should do? But don't then go to your superior, don't go to the public, don't go to a judge and say, oh, Google or Microsoft made me do it. It's your choice. You have to stand behind that decision.
Will that translate to more organizations being very conservative in terms of how they are implementing AI? Because they have to bear the ultimate responsibility, right? And on top of that, they are not quite sure what is the data that went into some of these large models. They have no control over some of these implementation. So will that then translate to organizations being a lot more conservative and say, hey, maybe I shouldn't be adopting or using AI just yet? Michael?
I think it comes back to, again, the speed of innovation is a little bit ahead of us, right? So yes, you can use the system, but you have to assume the responsibility of the output. Right? I mean, the fundamental challenge with generative AI is that we don't know really how to test those systems, right? I mean, you train a massive generative AI system on everything that's on the internet. What do you expect it to learn? There's a lot of stuff on the internet that you don't want to repeat. So it's not a surprise, but how do you control it is not quite clear yet. In classical AI systems in the past, it was a number, a probability. We could pretty clearly see where it's right, where it's wrong. At least you can measure it. Now, if text is an output or an image is an output, that's in the bias is almost my own interpretation, and it's not easy to codify that. So it comes down to where you are in the world, right? Your interpretation of a certain output might be completely different than in another part of the world. So it really is up to the end user, the agency, the company that is using it and using the output to make sure that they stand behind it.
So Zeke, any response to that? How can one organization deal with something like that?
Well, I would say that I want to make the point that the answer is not binary. It's not like either you use or you don't use, right? AI systems are tools that you choose to bring in, and if you bring it into your processes within the organization, you can figure out to what extent you want to bring it in. You can figure out which steps you want to introduce it in. You can figure out the level of human involvement that you want to retain, and you can make a decision around the kind of risk that you're prepared to run and the kind of risk that you will not accept. We all make those decisions when we design our workflows, even without AI, right? Depending on the level of staff we have, the number of headcount that we have, what's the volume we have. We put in rules, we put in SOPs, we put in those things to make sure that it can run efficiently. I would say treat AI as one additional component you could add in that planning mix, right? But don't think that it will solve all problems. It's one additional tool. But how you had designed your processes in the past, that approach you must retain, right? The level of human involvement, that's something you can control. How much you want to automate, that's what you can control as well. So think of it that way, and not something binary about you either bring it in or you don't bring it in.
Yes, Prithvi.
Yeah, so I think this is no different than adopting any technology, right? But I think, like rightly said, it's just so happened that this just moved so fast. But I think the good news is pretty much most senior leadership I speak in private companies, they are aware of the problem and they're thinking hard about the problem. The question they ask is, what are the guardrails we can put in place? So I like this whole concept of, you don't have to do like a mass rollout and let's start looking at all the data and do it. You could do like a small sample set, small data set, small use cases, and then learn from it. Because though I would like to say, okay, you could do things like look at the input that's going into these models, do an inventory of all the data that's going in, look at the output, do some kind of data pen testing on what's coming out of the prompt. But the answer, it's still early, right? Those technologies, we're still trying to understand the problem. So I would say from a safe adoption perspective, I think building the guardrails and trying to look at simpler use cases, rolling it out, learning, and then doing it in batches. But at the end of the day, I think you can't outsource responsibility, right? I can't say that, I use something else and someone else's problem. You can't do that, right? That just is not going to work.
Yeah, it's actually a more pronounced problem in generative AI because there are so many parties involved. As much as you can't outsource responsibility, you also want to look towards your supplier and say, hey, they have to be responsible for something as well, right? And that, I think, then therein lies finding that balance between what is it that you have to carry and what is it that you expect your supplier to carry on your behalf, and then making sure that is addressed in being clear about the responsibilities, in being clear about what happens when something terrible happens, and then as well as maybe that's something that has to be addressed in contract. Yes.
Like just to add, right? A good example of this is when when companies started using their cloud for their workloads as transferred, right? Suddenly they realized there's no perimeter, right? The security became their responsibility because cloud security provider gave them an API. I think it's similar, right? But this is just moving much, much, much faster.
Exactly. I think actually we are making the same point as well. I mean, on the cloud has shared responsibility frameworks. The CSPs have come up with some of these things, and can we adapt some of these ideas for AI? Yes, Simon.
Yeah, so my concern, it actually goes back to the very good point Zeke made about consent. And up until now, data protection, I mean, all of us in the room have clicked, I consent to things we didn't actually read. I've done books on data protection, I don't read them either. My concern is that we might see something similar with generative AI. And already you've seen a shift in the kind of disclaimer that you get. And you can imagine a scenario that becomes a bit like data protection, where at the moment, data protection is all premised on this illusion of consent, that in theory, you've consented to using your personal data. And you could imagine a few years from now, we're relying on generative AI for all sorts of things, and 99% of the time, it's great. 99% of the time, it's correct. 1% of the time, it screws up. And you can imagine the developer and the deployer have some sort of contractual relationship, who's responsible for what, but that the users, in order to use this system, have consented to terms and conditions that include that we accept responsibility for the output and promise not to sue. And in theory, in law, that's all fine, but in practice, as we become more dependent on these systems and people use it for everything from directions, probably low risk, to counseling, a bit more risk, to medical advice, high risk, or security considerations, if we're not able to chase it back up the accountability chain, then we're going to have a problem.
Yeah, and I think if we truly believe that AI is going to be as big as impactful as it will be, it's been compared to the invention of the steam engine, the invention of the electricity, the discovery of fire. I mean, that's a very high bar. If that's truly the case, we'll see it as part of pretty much every software system. So we need to, I think, think and how do we look at software licensing and software systems in general, because it will be a natural part of it. It's just not handwritten code. I mean, in the past, you probably consented to a lot of things that pertain to normal code, but even normal code has lots of errors that goes wrong here and there. And with AI systems, it's going to be exactly the same. So we just have to accept that it's part of a more complex environment going forward.
But I think that what you guys just spoke about has already come to pass, right? In my pockets, in my mobile phone, right? To get here, I use mapping software. AI is involved, right? Yeah. I play around with photographs, right? It used to be that you had to really know how to do Photoshop to do a panoramic stitch photographs to form a panorama. These days, AI does it for you, cleans up, does bunnies for you. It's already there, right? I use these examples because to make the point that I think the horse has bolted from the stable, right? I have full confidence, not because I'm biased, probably I am, that I'm from the legal sector. I have full confidence that in those situations when you need to figure out liability, the lawyers and the courts will find a way around that. But I think the points that what we want to achieve here around today's topic is really, let's create these clearer frameworks and clearer standards so that for the good players who wants to be responsible, they are able to point to something that they have an input in, something that's achievable, have an ecosystem that is able to support their representation to say that, I've done what I can, right, to make sure that it meets these standards and it's safe. There will always be the bad actors. but that's what keeps governments, policymakers, law enforcement engaged, right?
Yeah, there's actually a question here about, are there regulations to protect the victims of bad AI? I suppose people using bad AI for crimes and for other terrible outcomes, right? But maybe also whether there are any regulations to protect people from implementing bad AI, protect people from organizations that implement bad AI. But I think we've already sort of discussed that already, so I'll not get into that.
But I actually want to
Maybe
challenge. I wanted to challenge that a little bit, because we also have to think about the good AI that doesn't get implemented if we're too tight on it, right? So what if my doctor doesn't use an AI system, misses some tumor, and the AI system would have picked it up? Can I now sue for malpractice because he should have used a better tool? I don't know. I mean, these are, I think, all open questions we'll have to address.
And actually, that's one of those things that we've actually been discussing for a number of years now. You see, one of the big things that many sectors, lawyers not being the only ones that we have to deal with, I think law enforcement as well, the volume of information that we now have to process, it's become impossible to do it in the old-fashioned way where you're just looking at one document, one email at a time. I know that 10 years ago, even here, we started using, document review systems to assist, right, in processing documentary evidence for white-collar crimes and stuff like that. So, can you imagine a situation where if you don't use those tools, and a case takes 10 times as long to investigate, or you miss things out, right? So I think that there's a lot to be said. That we really just need to remember that these are tools that are available. Finding the right way to implement it, finding the right way to introduce it is absolutely important. And one final point is really that I have full faith in the confidence of our law, that it doesn't, a crime is a crime, whether you use a traditional software to do it, a fancy AI system to do it, right? A crime is still a crime.
Coming from a lawyer, a crime is still a crime. I'm going to come to Simon, since you're talking about misuse of AI and misuse of AI, whether you have a point of view on that, which is going to be a bigger concern.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll come back to surveillance, because I assume it's relevant to many people here. And it's interesting, when you survey people, they're very wary about surveillance. But which is worse? Is it worse for a I think probably the worst is a particular group to be subject to special scrutiny. That raises particular hackles. But for many people, the idea that an individual officer is listening in on a conversation or watching a closed-circuit TV camera, that raises all sorts of concerns. One way to avoid either of these problems is simple. You automate surveillance and surveil everyone. And so if there's a threshold for someone paying special scrutiny to your behavior, that kind of chilling effect that people worry about, that might be addressed by having more systematic surveillance. It goes back, I think, to Zeke's point about, he didn't frame it quite this way, but what is the problem you're trying to solve? What is the harm you're trying to avoid? And so in the surveillance space, it's that idea of either, back to my ethics and pragmatism, it's either treating people as means rather than ends, so subjecting them to unfair behavior based on circumstances beyond their control, or something that's not going to work. And so in some cases, that might actually mean that the misuses are worse than the misuse, if you can balance it out. But as I think has been clear from this discussion, we're still at an early stage of coming to a landing on at least some of these questions.
Definitely an early stage. And I note that we have slightly less than 2 minutes left on time. I thought maybe I'll just ask each of you to give maybe one piece of advice to the audience on how they should think about safe adoption of AI. Maybe starting with Prithvi.
Yeah. So I think I'm still learning, so I don't have much advice, but I think I'll probably end with a call to action. I think there are a lot of folks here who are in a position of power to influence policy, influence frameworks. I think that's what's really, really needed. I think we have an opportunity here to get ahead of the problem. And because my biggest worry is if we don't do this right, you can end up stifling innovation. And also people always find a way, right? So I think the right thing is if people around here who think harder about the problem than many of us do, can go and start kind of contributing and shaping, I think that would be net way more beneficial. I just want to leave it to that.
Mike?
I think it starts with merely responsible AI at the core of everything that you do in designing your systems. It has to be human-centric. Is it good for us? I mean, it's everybody's responsibility that's using a system, that's designing a system, that's building a system. It can't be just regulation. It can't be just enforcement. It really comes down to everyone from the scientist to the engineer building the system, the users using the system. We have to come together and look at this as a responsible use of a very, very powerful technology that will do so much good if we just let it do that and not abuse it in the wrong ways.
Zeke?
Well, we started with transparency. We talked about standards, and we ended up about sometimes you actually need to use this because it's more efficient, and that's something you need to do, right? But I think the way I look at it is that all these things it can be topics for discussions for regulation, policy making, but ultimately heading an organization that actually has to consider deploying these things, my primary consideration is when I deploy it, right? How do I do it in a way that actually engenders and builds up the trust that I have with our users of our services? And I will do transparency where I have to. I will test to benchmarks if I have to, right? And I will implement it if I am able to provide a better quality of service. But it's really around how do I ensure that I build up that trust, right? And I actually create greater trust. And I think if you use it that way, then all these principles make a lot more sense and wouldn't be seen as hurdles.
Yeah, I was going to say two things, one of which Zeke's essentially already said. So the two things. Anyone in a management position has two kinds of roles, administration and leadership. And so in the administrative sphere, I mean, if you have people who are doing repetitive, cognitive, low-risk functions, that's ripe for optimization, particularly if it's low risk. But in terms of the leadership, your stock in trade, the most important thing, the reason for Homeland Security is trust. Trust in institutions, and so that's your currency. That's the most important thing. And so if it's a tension between administrative efficiency and trust wins every time. Not just your trust in the system, but the people's trust in you, which is always going to make your job a lot easier if you have that positive, reinforcing social contract relationship, that they understand what your job is, how important it is, will always make it a bit easier, hopefully, for you to do that job.
Exactly, trust. And in Singapore, AI governance is really about building trust with the people, creating that trusted ecosystem to facilitate both AI innovation as well as protecting people from misuse of AI, as well as all the problems that AI may cause. And finding that balance, I think, is really important. And I hope that today's conversation gave you a sort of an idea of what are some of the considerations and the issues that we have to go through in this space. And I'd like you to now, together with me, thank the wonderful panelists for their insights and the discussion. And thank you all of you for being a wonderful audience and for some of the questions that came into Pigeonhole. Thank you.